Welcome to Lesson 4 of the course, Cooperative Individualism, the third way to the just society. The title of this lesson is Cooperative Individualism Rediscovered. Even amidst the turmoil of the 19th century, there were those who sought inspiration from those who had struggled but failed to bring about the just society. In this sense, the principles of cooperative individualism always found some level of support. The question would be whether they might ever rise out of the wilderness and enter the mainstream of political and philosophical discourse. In this struggle, cooperative individualists briefly gained center stage because of the determination of one person, the writer, newspaper editor, and self-taught political economist Henry George. During this era, the Russian sociologist Maksim Kovalevsky noted the growing influence of Henry George's campaigns on events in late 19th century England, where Marx's Capital remained to be completed by Engels. Kovalevsky wrote, "Knowledge of history of economic doctrines enabled the author of Capital to determine at once the degree of originality of writers who forced themselves on the attention of the public by the striking form of their works. In saying this, I have in mind mainly Henry George, for whom almost as much enthusiasm was shown at one time in England as for the person and doctrines of Rousseau in the 18th century." The public career of Henry George lasted but a quarter century. His first years as a writer and lecturer occurred while living in San Francisco. By an informal study of the writings of prominent political economists, and by his capacity for objective observation and analysis, he developed a deep understanding of how important to human survival is access to nature, to land and all the resources nature provides for our use. In 1868, he put some of his analysis into an article titled, "What the Railroad Will Bring Us." More expansively, he next wrote the book, Our Land and Land Policy. After another decade of personal struggles and the pursuit of a more complete understanding of societal organization and what he came to believe were natural laws governing the production and distribution of wealth, Henry George accepted the challenge of putting all that he had learned into one book. He began the writing in August of 1877, finishing the manuscript 19 months later. In a 1905 introduction to his father's work, Progress and Poverty, an inquiry into the cause of industrial depressions and of increase of want with increase of wealth, the remedy, Henry George Jr. recalled the emotional release his father experienced upon the book's completion. And when the last page was written, in the dead of night, when he was entirely alone, Henry George flung himself upon his knees and wept like a child. He had kept his vow. The rest was in the Master's hands. Henry George moved to New York City to promote his book. He ended up becoming the charismatic leader of a worldwide effort to change the course of history by the adoption of the principles of cooperative individualism. The timing appeared to be right. Throughout much of the English-speaking parts of the world, there was deep consternation over British imperialism, and in particular, the continued exploitation of the people of Ireland by their British overlords. Henry George was hired by the New York newspaper Irish World to report on the conflict. In an article written in 1881, he put the situation into a broader context. George wrote, "Irish landlordism is not merely a British interest in the sense that its spoils are largely drawn to Great Britain by Irish landlords residing there, or to pay interest on mortgages held by British capitalists, but it is part and parcel of the system which enables the dominant class in Great Britain to live in idleness on the labor of their own countrymen, and they have the same direct concern in maintaining Irish landlordism as the slaveholders of South Carolina would have had in preventing a successful insurrection of slaves in North Carolina." Henry George was drafted in 1886 by his supporters to stand for election to the office of mayor of New York City. Accepting the nomination, he sent out a call for action to every part of the globe. We are beginning a movement for the abolition of industrial slavery, and what we do on this side of the water will send its impulse across the land and over the sea, and give courage to all men to think and act. As one might have predicted, reactions to Henry George's analysis of landed privilege as the cause of poverty yielded a far greater response from political economists and others in Britain than initially occurred in the United States, where access to land was still considered widespread. After reading Progress and Poverty, the clergyman and future economist Philip Wicksteed wrote enthusiastically to Henry George in 1882, vowing to join the crusade George had initiated. However, within the ranks of professors of political economy, there was virtually no support forthcoming. The reaction of these college and university professors is well summarized by comments made by Arnold Toynbee in a letter to his sister written in 1882. I have known George's book for a very long time. I always thought it, while full of fallacies and crude conceptions, very remarkable for its style and vigor, and while no economist would be likely for a moment to be staggered by its theories, it is very likely to seem convincing to the general reader. Toynbee's assessment aside, a review of Progress and Poverty in one of Britain's newspapers published by the radical liberals declared that every Englishman ought to read the book and announced the paper would take subscriptions for it. Another quite revealing observation was made by a biographer of Adam Smith, John Ray. In his book on contemporary socialism, he included a long chapter on Henry George, while acknowledging the American was not a socialist. His reason for including Henry George was as follows. Because his doctrines are in many respects closely allied with those of socialism, and because he has done more than any other single person to stir and deepen in this country an agitation which, if not socialist, at least promises to be a mother of socialism. In the fall of 1880, Michael Davitt, leader of the Irish Land League, came to the United States to speak and raise funds. Henry George met with him and convinced Davitt to campaign for the public collection of the rent of land as key to ending landed privilege in Ireland. Yet in his public addresses, Davitt called for land nationalization based on a plan put forward by Alfred Russel Wallace of paying landowners half the market valuation. George's solution seemed to Davitt far more difficult to achieve politically. Henry George then penned a short book, The Irish Land Question, What It Involves, and How Alone It Can Be Settled. This book was published in New York, then reprinted in London, Manchester, and Glasgow. This book caused a far greater sensation at this point than was the case with Progress and Poverty. In response, George was engaged by the Irish world to travel to Ireland and report on the popular agitation against British rule and for land reform. An early convert to the cooperative individualism of Henry George was the stepdaughter of Britain's most renowned political economist, John Stuart Mill. She told Henry George that if Mill was still alive, he had died in 1873, he would have stood with Henry George in the fight against landed privilege. Back in New York, Michael Davitt was making his own case to American supporters. At the same event, the other prominent speaker was the Reverend Father Edward McGlynn of St. Stephen's Catholic Church. McGlynn joined Davitt at several other speaking engagements. On one of these occasions, he spoke of how Progress and Poverty had directed his thinking on social problems. When the population shall have increased here, as it has elsewhere in proportion to our extent of territory, we shall have precisely the same problem to solve, and the sooner we solve it, the better. And so I quite agree with Michael Davitt to the full, and with Henry George to the full. And lest any timid, scrupulous soul might fear that I was falling into the arms of Henry George, I say that I stand on the same platform with Bishop Nulty of Meath, Ireland. McGlynn was referring to Thomas Nulty, at the time the Roman Catholic Bishop of Meath, who had delivered powerful sermons against landed privilege in Ireland. McGlynn continued, "But for that matter, to let you again into a secret, my private opinion is that if I had to fall into the arms of anybody, I don't know a man into whose arms I should be more willing to fall than into the arms of Henry George." Upon his return to the United States, Henry George and others founded the Free Soil Society. New York attorney and an accomplished journalist, Louis F. Post, joined and became president. The first translation of Progress and Poverty into another language occurred in 1880 into German by C.D.F. Gutschow. 5 years later, a land league was founded in Berlin to fight to implement Henry George's system of reform. The German edition of Progress and Poverty was reviewed critically by the German economist Adolph Wagner. However, a decade later, Wagner had changed his opinion and publicly acknowledged his agreement with Henry George's analysis. In 1966, Leo Tolstoy's former secretary, Victor Lebrun, wrote that Count Tolstoy obtained German editions of Henry George's two books, Social Problems and Progress and Poverty, in 1885. Tolstoy, a short time thereafter, wrote to his wife, "This morning I read George instead of writing. This is a very important book. This is a step forward of equal importance to the liberation of our serfs. This is the liberation of the earth from private ownership, and it is necessary to read George, who defined the problem with precision and definitively. After this, there is no more debating. One has to take resolutely one side or the other. Personally, I demand much more than he does, but his project is the first step of the ladder which I would like to climb." Tolstoy would remain a passionate proponent of Henry George's system of political economy, trying to convince the Russian Tsar and others in Russia that George offered the only path to peaceful change. Few at the center of power were to listen. Throughout the 1880s, single tax leagues were formed in country after country, as Henry George's works were translated and distributed into the major languages of the world. In 1928, George Bernard Shaw, who as a young man had attended more than one lecture by Henry George, reflected on the times and influence of George's campaign. Between Karl Marx and Sidney and Beatrice Webb came Henry George with his Progress and Poverty, which converted many to land nationalization. It was the work of a man who had seen that the conversion of an American village to a city of millionaires was also the conversion of a place where people could live and let live in tolerable comfort to an inferno of seething poverty and misery. And yet Shaw and most others failed to grasp the full nature of George's cooperative individualism. They could not see a future in which workers and the owners of industry would derive mutual benefit by the elimination of all taxation and a reliance on the rent of land to pay for democratically agreed upon public goods and services. As George Bernard Shaw recalled, Tolstoy was one of his notable converts, but most of the young men whom he had led up to it went through, like myself, into the Fabian Society and other socialist bodies. Even before Henry George's death in 1897, other writers accepted the challenge to defend Henry George's analysis to restate his principles. In the United States, Louis F. Post lectured extensively on the principles he shared with Henry George. His 1894 book on the subject went through 5 editions, In the last, in 1915, he concludes, "Many events subsequent to his writing have gone to prove that Henry George was right. Each new phase of the social problem makes it still more clear that the disorderly development of our civilization is explained fundamentally by inequality in the ownership of land. Equality as to the use of Mother Earth, that and that alone secures to everyone an equal opportunity to participate in production and full ownership by each producer of his own share. This is justice. This is order. Unless our civilization have it for a foundation, new forms of slavery will assuredly lead on into new forms of barbarism." Until his death in 1928, Louis F. Post wrote and campaigned vigorously on behalf of cooperative individualism's principles and policy objectives. He was appointed by President Woodrow Wilson to the cabinet position of Assistant Secretary of Labor, serving to 1921. Yet even at the center of power, Post could not build consensus to convert principle into policy. Another determined proponent of cooperative individualism was Russian-born Max Hirsch, who traveled extensively in a business career, establishing himself in the Australian city of Melbourne in 1890. Earlier, he had absorbed and become an ardent supporter of Henry George's principles. In 1892, he gave up business to devote himself to the promotion of his principles. He began writing, producing his most widely read and acclaimed work, Democracy versus Socialism, in 1901. The warning he sounded then is all too familiar to us today. Wealth is gradually concentrating in fewer and fewer hands, a process which, if unchecked, must ultimately lead to the division of a population into two warring classes with no interest in common: a ruling plutocracy holding irresponsible power and using it ruthlessly to oppress the people, confronted by a mass of hopeless proletarians forever striving to shake off the yoke imposed upon them. What he identified as the essence of justice is guaranteeing to all what we all need to survive. All men have equal rights to the use of land, and each of them is entitled to the exclusive possession of all the wealth which his labor produces or his services procure, provided he infringes not the equal rights of all others. Disregard of the equal right to land necessarily involves violations of the unequal right to wealth. Social injustice in the production and distribution of wealth thus arises from the disregard of the equal rights of all men to the use of the earth. The movement that arose around the person and writings of Henry George at its height in the late 1800s was already losing ground to far more radical attacks on entrenched hierarchical societal structure. The chain of crises and wars that had plagued humanity as the 20th century advanced caused many reformers, including cooperative individualists, to compromise on principles in order to achieve some degree of improvement. To be sure, the day-to-day living conditions of a large portion of the world's population were insufferable. Every industrialized and industrializing society suffered from the plague of entrenched privilege. How much longer would the world's oppressed people stand for these conditions? And would the coming changes alter the course of history for the better or the worse? And so we've reached the end of Lesson 4.